Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Excited to be here.
Today we're tackling a topic that I know a lot of you have been curious about. Hiring MATLAB developers.
Yeah, it can be a little daunting, right?
Definitely. It seems like everyone's looking for these MATLAB wizards these days.
For good reason, too. They're the brains behind some incredible innovations.
Absolutely. And to help us navigate this complex world, we've got some awesome insights from, you guessed it, theperfectdeveloper.com.
Always a fantastic resource.
Their MATLAB Developers Playbook guide is like a treasure trove of tips for anyone looking to hire, well, the perfect MATLAB developer.
I was just going through it the other day. It's packed with practical advice.
And speaking of practical advice, before we dive into the nitty-gritty, I want to mention a really cool feature they have on their site.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more.
It's called the 5 questions. And it's this quick quiz that helps you figure out exactly what type of developer you need for your specific project.
Genius. Takes the guesswork out of it.
Right. So if you're feeling lost or overwhelmed, head over to theperfectdeveloper.com and try the 5 questions. It could save you a ton of time and headaches down the road.
Great tip. All right, so let's get down to business.
Let's do it.
Sure.
First things first, what exactly is a MATLAB developer?
So a MATLAB developer is basically a software engineer or a computational specialist who's really skilled in using, obviously, MATLAB.
Okay, that makes sense. But the guide uses this term computational specialist, which I love.
Right, it sounds so much cooler than just coder.
It totally does. So what kind of things do these computational specialists do all day? Are they just sitting there coding nonstop?
It's definitely more than just coding. They design algorithms, they analyze data, they build models. They basically take all this complex information and turn it into something useful.
Okay, so I'm picturing them like solving equations and writing lines of code all day long.
That's definitely part of it, but it's also very collaborative.
Oh, interesting. So they're not just lone wolves in a dark room.
Not at all. They need to be able to communicate their findings, explain complex concepts, and work with other teams to actually implement their solutions.
So those soft skills are crucial.
Absolutely. You can be the most brilliant coder in the world, but if you can't explain your work to anyone, it's not going to be very helpful.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a better sense of what they do, but what makes MATLAB developers different from, say, a Python developer or a JavaScript developer?
That's a great question. One of the key things that sets them apart is their focus on scientific computing and data analysis.
Right. The guide mentions that they often have a strong background in math and algorithms.
Exactly. Things like linear algebra, calculus, statistics, all that fun stuff.
So they need to be mathematical ninjas.
Pretty much. And that's why they're so valuable in fields like engineering, finance, healthcare, anywhere you need to crunch numbers and extract insights from data.
I'm starting to see why they're in such high demand.
Oh yeah, their skills are hot commodities right now.
So if I'm looking to hire a MATLAB developer, what are some of the key skills I should be looking for? Is it enough to just know the MATLAB language?
Knowing MATLAB is obviously a must-have, but it's just the starting point.
Okay, so what else should be on my checklist?
Well, like we said, a strong foundation in math and algorithms is essential.
Right, those mathematical ninjas we were talking about.
Exactly. But beyond the technical skills, you also want someone who can communicate effectively, work well in a team, and think critically.
So those soft skills come into play again.
They're super important. Remember, you're not just hiring a set of hands, you're bringing someone into your team.
That's a really good point. It's about finding someone who's not just technically proficient, but also a good fit for your company's culture.
Exactly. The MATLAB Developers Playbook guide actually emphasizes this, finding someone who aligns with your team's communication style and values.
It's a holistic approach to hiring.
Definitely. You want someone who can contribute to the team's success on multiple levels.
This is all great information, but now let's get to the question that's probably on everyone's mind. How much does it cost to hire one of these talented individuals?
The million-dollar question.
So spill the beans. What kind of salary range are we talking about here?
Well, the guide says that it can vary quite a bit depending on factors like experience, location, and industry.
Okay, that makes sense. But can you give us a ballpark figure?
Sure. For entry-level developers, you might be looking at somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 per year.
Okay, that's a good starting point.
But for senior-level developers with specialized skills, it can easily go over $150,000.
Wow, that's quite a range.
It is. And it's important to remember that these are just averages. The actual salary you offer will depend on a lot of different factors.
Right, like the candidate's experience, the specific skills they bring to the table, and even the location of your company.
Exactly. The guide has a whole section on factors affecting salary that's really helpful.
So it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Nope. Each hiring situation is unique.
Okay, so we've covered the basics. What a MATLAB developer is, what skills to look for, and the general salary range.
We've laid the groundwork.
But now, the big decision. Do you hire full-time, part-time, or go the freelance route?
The age-old question.
And luckily, the MATLAB Developers Playbook guide actually walks you through the pros and cons of each hiring model.
It's a great starting point for figuring out which model is right for your specific needs.
Exactly. So let's break down those options.
Sounds good to me. So first up, let's talk about the good old-fashioned full-time hire.
The classic. What are the advantages there?
Well, the big one is control.
Control over what exactly?
Over the whole development process.
I see.
When you have someone in-house, you have more say in how things are done. You can directly manage their workload and make sure they're aligned with your company's goals.
Makes sense.
And another huge advantage is integration.
Integration.
Yeah, your full-time MATLAB developer is right there in the trenches with the rest of your team.
Part of the company culture.
Exactly. They can easily collaborate with other departments, get feedback quickly, and really become a core part of your company's DNA.
Sounds like having a full-timer has some serious perks, but I imagine there are downsides too.
Of course, there's always a trade-off.
So what are the cons of going full-time?
Well, the biggest one is probably the cost.
Yeah, salaries, benefits, all that jazz adds up.
Exactly. You're not just paying for their expertise, you're also covering their healthcare, their vacation time, their office space, all that overhead.
That can be a real strain on the budget, especially for smaller companies or startups.
Right, and that's where the other hiring models come in.
Part-time and freelance.
Yep, those can be really attractive options if you're working with limited resources.
So let's talk part-time first. What are the pros and cons there?
Well, the main advantage of part-time is flexibility.
Flexibility for who?
For both you and the developer.
Okay, how so?
Well, you only have them on the payroll for the hours you need them, which can be a huge cost saver.
And for the developer?
They get to set their own schedule and maybe even work on multiple projects at once.
So it's a win-win.
Potentially. But there are some things to consider.
Like what?
Well, communication and coordination can be a bit more challenging with a part-timer.
Right. They're not always available for those impromptu meetings or quick questions.
Exactly. And you also need to be very clear about expectations and deliverables from the get-go.
Makes sense. So part-time is all about finding that balance between flexibility and effective communication.
Exactly.
Okay, so then there's freelance. That's become really popular in recent years.
It has, and for good reason.
So what are the main advantages of hiring a freelance MATLAB developer?
Well, the biggest one is access to a global talent pool.
Oh, interesting. You're not limited to just the developers in your local area.
Exactly. You can literally find the best MATLAB expert in the world, no matter where they're located.
That's amazing. And I imagine it could be a lot more cost-effective too, right?
It can be. Especially if you're looking for someone with a very specific niche skill set.
Like a MATLAB developer who specializes in, say, image processing algorithms for medical devices.
Precisely. Finding that person locally could be a nightmare, but with freelance platforms, you can connect with specialists from all over the globe.
That opens up so many possibilities.
It does. But of course, there are also some challenges with freelancing.
I was just about to ask about that. What are the downsides?
Well, the biggest one is probably the lack of direct control.
Ah, I see. You're not their direct employer.
Right. You're essentially hiring them for a specific project or task.
So you have less control over their day-to-day work.
Exactly. And that can sometimes lead to communication issues, especially if you're working across different time zones.
Right. Those late-night emails and early morning calls can get tiring.
They can. And you also need to be very diligent about vetting freelance developers.
Vetting.
Yeah, making sure they actually have the skills and experience they claim to have.
Ah, so it's important to do your due diligence.
Absolutely. There are a lot of talented freelance MATLAB developers out there, but there are also some who might oversell their abilities.
So how can you make sure you're hiring someone who's the real deal?
That's where theperfectdeveloper.com comes in handy again.
Tell me more.
Their platform does a lot of the heavy lifting for you in terms of vetting and verifying developers.
So they're kind of like matchmakers for companies and developers.
Exactly. They make sure that the developers on their platform have the skills and experience they claim to have, and they also help you find the perfect match for your specific needs.
That takes a lot of stress out of the hiring process.
It does. So whether you go full-time, part-time, or freelance, it really depends on your company's specific situation.
Right. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. You need to weigh the pros and cons of each model and decide what makes the most sense for your budget, your timeline, and your project requirements.
Okay, so we've talked about different hiring models, but there's another big decision to make. Do you bring your MATLAB development in-house or outsource it to a specialized company?
That's a biggie. And it's a question that a lot of companies struggle with.
So what are the key factors to consider when making that decision?
Well, the MATLAB Developers Playbook guide actually breaks it down into two main categories: control and cost.
Okay, those are pretty big factors. Let's start with control. What do they say about that?
So when you bring development in-house, you have a much higher level of control over every aspect of the process.
So you're calling the shots. You get to decide who to hire, how the project is managed, what tools and technologies are used.
Exactly. You're basically building your own little MATLAB powerhouse within your company.
Sounds pretty empowering.
It can be. But that level of control also comes with a lot of responsibility.
I can imagine.
You're responsible for recruiting, hiring, training, managing, and retaining your MATLAB developers.
And that can be a lot of work, especially if you're not already familiar with the intricacies of MATLAB development.
Right. It's not just about finding someone who can code in MATLAB. It's about building a whole team and creating a supportive environment where they can thrive.
So it's a big commitment.
It definitely is. And that's why a lot of companies choose to outsource instead.
Ah, the outsourcing option. So what does the guide say about the control aspect when it comes to outsourcing?
Well, when you outsource, you're essentially handing over some of that control to the outsourcing company.
Makes sense. You're trusting them to find the right developers, manage the project, and deliver the results you're looking for.
Exactly. And that can be a bit nerve-wracking for some companies, especially if they're used to having a tight grip on everything.
Yeah, letting go can be tough.
It can be, but it can also be incredibly liberating.
How so?
Well, it frees you up to focus on your core business.
Ah, I see. You don't have to spend all your time and energy on building and managing a MATLAB development team. You can outsource that and focus on what you do best.
Exactly. And that can be a huge advantage, especially for companies that are rapidly growing or have limited resources.
So it's all about prioritizing and making strategic decisions about where to allocate your resources.
Exactly. Now, the other big factor to consider is cost.
Right, because at the end of the day, it all comes down to the bottom line.
It does. And the guide says that outsourcing can often be more cost-effective than building an in-house team.
Really? Why is that?
Well, for starters, you're not paying for all that overhead we talked about earlier: salaries, benefits, office space, all that.
Those costs can add up quickly.
They can. And with outsourcing, you're typically paying a fixed price for a specific project or set of deliverables.
So you know exactly what you're getting into from the start.
Exactly. And that can make budgeting a lot easier.
But hold on, if you're going with a fixed price, doesn't that mean you have less flexibility to change things along the way?
It can, but that's why it's so important to choose your outsourcing partner carefully.
Right. You need to make sure you're on the same page from the beginning and that they're willing to be flexible if your needs change.
Exactly. Communication is key, and that goes for both in-house and outsourced development.
Absolutely. You need to establish clear expectations, set up regular check-ins, and make sure everyone's on the same page.
Right. And that's another area where theperfectdeveloper.com can really help.
How so?
Well, they have a whole team of experts who can guide you through the outsourcing process, from finding the right partner to managing the project and ensuring quality control.
So they're not just a platform for finding developers, they're also a valuable resource for navigating the whole outsourcing landscape.
Precisely. They can save you a lot of time, money, and headaches.
Okay, this has been incredibly insightful. So to wrap things up, what are the key takeaways our listeners should remember when it comes to hiring MATLAB developers?
First, remember that MATLAB developers are highly skilled professionals who bring a lot of value to the table.
They're not just coders, they're problem solvers, innovators, and data wizards.
Exactly. And second, remember that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to hiring.
Right. Whether you go full-time, part-time, freelance, in-house, or outsource, it all depends on your company's specific needs and circumstances.
And third, don't be afraid to ask for help.
There are resources out there like theperfectdeveloper.com that can guide you through the process and help you find the perfect MATLAB developer for your team.
And don't forget about that awesome tool, the 5 questions, on their website. It's a quick and easy way to figure out exactly what type of developer you need.
It's a lifesaver. Well, that's it for our deep dive into the world of hiring MATLAB developers.
We hope you found it helpful.
If you're thinking about adding a MATLAB expert to your team, remember the tips and insights we've shared today.
And don't hesitate to check out theperfectdeveloper.com for all your MATLAB hiring needs.
They really are the experts in this field.
Until next time, happy hiring.
And keep on coding.